All right, everyone. Thank you for staying here till we have our final talk of the morning. I also want to take this minute to invite you to come tomorrow. We're going to kick it off at 12:45, same Zoom, and with the first talk being at 1 o'clock. So our final speaker of the day is Mya Manzo. She grew up on this island, and she decided early on that she wanted to do a project that would contribute to the greater good of this island. And I consider Mya as a integral person to make change in the future. I think this is just the beginning of the good work that she's doing, and I we're going to see some really fantastic stuff from her in the future and right now with her talk. So please join me and welcome her to the stage.
My name is Mya Manzo, and I'll be presenting on reforming Rule 17 landscaping requirements to promote native Lāʻau and limit invasive plants in Hawaiʻi County. My mentors for my internship were Bethany Morrison with the County Planning Department and Kendra Obermaier with the Office of Sustainability, Climate, Equity. I'll briefly go over the outline of my talk. I'll go over my introduction, background, in landscaping, and what plants are being used in our landscaping, and kind of the reason why to amend the Rule 17 landscaping requirements, and then the objectives of my internship. And then I'll go over my approach, which included a plant inventory, interviews, and a survey. And then my overall outcomes, which included education and outreach, and my suggested rule amendments, and concluding with my broader impacts. So the County Planning Department was the primary agency I interned with to work on creating amendments to their landscaping rule, which is located in the Rules of Practice and Procedure. Quality of life, such as creating the general plan for this island. The Administrative Permits Division within the Planning Department is responsible for plan approvals, which enforce the code and rules of the Planning Department. The Office of Sustainability, Climate, Equity, and Resilience, or OSCAR for short. They were a key part in my internship, working closely with them to involve community outreach and distribute my education materials. And the focus of OSCAR, they work on creating access to resources regarding sustainability and climate, and try to provide resources for the community. So what is landscaping? To the dictionary definition, landscaping is the art of making a piece of land more visually appealing by altering the existing design, adding ornamental features, create a buffer or screening, or shade, or adding some functionality for aesthetical purposes. It also has been shown to promote mental health and support the environment if used properly. Non-native plants are often used in landscaping, but native plants is a concept slowly being recognized that provides benefits to improve biodiversity, hydrology, and economic and culture in the community. Increasing native and Polynesian introduced plants and landscapes provide key resources for community engagement in natural ecosystems. Landscaping that I've come across through my project, doing interviews at the Four Seasons and Hilo landscapers. The photo on the left is the Four Seasons, which is an example of a private luxury landscaping. They try to incorporate Polynesian plants and native plants in their landscaping. And as you can see, they have used tea, the type of layering landscaping design, along with some non-native plants. And the middle photo is an example of native landscaping using lulu palms and Hilo as a shrub. So this was at Kukio, and I think they did a really great job of trying to incorporate native plants in their landscaping. Right. Photo on the right is an example of a park in Waikoloa where I conducted my plant inventory, and then these are showing the shade trees along the outside of the field and some of the nene enjoying the landscaping. So maintenance and irrigation are key things to think about in landscaping, especially in these luxury areas and parks. Some plants cause more litter fall than others or require more water. So we want to choose plants that cause the least amount of maintenance and cost for irrigation. Choose plants that meet the goals of your project. Our landscaping and how did these plants arrive to Hawaii? First plants to establish in Hawaii arrive by wind, water, or wind. These are our native plants. It's estimated that about 75% of native plants arrive by birds, 23% from ocean currents, and 2% by wind. According to Wagner et al., 1990, there's an estimate of 280 original flowering plants colonists that have gone through adaptive radiation, making new and unique species are endemic to Hawaii or to a single island. Now there are over 1,000 native flowering plants in Hawaii, with 90% being endemic. Over time, they have evolved to the various climates in Hawaii, and many have lost their defenses against delivery, which makes them vulnerable to being outcompeted by non-natives. Next, we have the Polynesian introduced plants that were brought to the islands around 1000 to 1100 AD by voyagers from Polynesia. Brought with them about 23 plants essential for survival, and chose plants for their usefulness, such as food cultivation, medicine, or building materials. Many are still used today, such as uwala, ulu, niu, tea, or kukui. Tea is one of the most common plants that are seen in the landscaping. And finally, the third component of plants to establish in Hawaii were introduced through the horticultural and nursery trade. Since 1778, when first Western contact was made, scientists estimate approximately 12,000 plants have been introduced to Hawaii, whether by accident or intentionally. Focusing on the ornamental plants, but many other plants have become invasive through introduction by agriculture or ranching purposes. From 1840 to 1990, there were 7,800 plants cultivated in Hawaii for landscaping or ornamental purposes, and 5% of them become naturalized, according to Schmidt and Drake. The plants that were brought here are not native and come from all over the world, what makes them a high risk of becoming invasive, so that Hawaii has low competition and a wide variety of climates that these plants could establish and take over in. So some concerns for landscaping with non-native plants is that there's a lack of regulation of what plant nurseries or chain stores can import to Hawaii. Other stores that import plants to be sold are able to bring in any plant without regulation. There is no law that restricts the import and sale of invasive plants. The only law that makes it illegal to sell or transfer invasive plants is a noxious weed law. However, this list of invasive plants is extremely outdated from 1992. There has been no update since to include many of the invasive plants that threaten the environment today. Although, on a positive note, there is a new bill in the process of being adopted to establish a state noxious weed coordinator that will update this list of noxious weeds. Additionally, there is limited plant knowledge within the community about the difference between a native and non-native or an invasive plant. Many people have grown up, for example, seeing plants that are around them, that have been around them their whole lives, but they're not native. But they were introduced to Hawaii, but some people may think that they're native, and this causes a confusion in what actually is a native. There's also limited knowledge in what plants actually grow, what native plants actually grow in different climate zones, because many are adapted to specific climates. So what contributes to non-native plants being used in landscaping over natives is that there's a lack of access to native plants. The commercial availability of native plants is limited. For example, I've seen invasive plants like lantana sold at like Home Depot instead of a native plant. Few nurseries will carry native plants, but if they do, they're mostly the most common and sold amongst native plants. So due to these concerns, there is a need for change to our landscaping standards, which were expressed by community members in the Hawaii County General Plan on the Integrated Climate Action Plan. The Hawaii County General Plan, Objective 1, under the Biocultural Stewardship Goal, states to increase the biodiversity and resilience of native habitat. Additional sub-objectives state to prioritize native plants and landscaping for all county projects, and to limit the introduction and establishment of invasive species. So one of the actions that was listed was to amend the landscape standards in the Rural Org Code. Calls for amending the landscape rules to promote a drought-resistant landscape. This plan is attempting to make the county more resilient against climate change impacts such as drought. Well, the County of Hawaii Planning Department Rule 17 landscaping requirements for the landscaping rule was adopted in 1998 and last amended in 2021. The purpose of the rule is to protect the well-being of the community by using landscaping to provide a buffer screening of plants between roadways, buildings, and industrialized areas. This will make commercial and industrial areas more visually appealing and minimize inconveniences from light, noise, or litter. Examples of projects that this rule applies to are construction or development on county-owned lands or commercial areas. County buildings, parks, apartment complexes, or any mom and pop shop. To increase the use of native and Polynesian introduced plants, to reduce the use of invasive plants in the landscaping, and to educate the benefits of using native over invasive plants in landscaping to the community. In the approach, I read and annotated the Rule 17 document and made a note of what was missing, what could be improved, and what needed to be removed. My initial analysis of the document is that although it mentioned that the purpose of the rule was to promote ecological and cultural value, it's lacking guidance and rigorous rulings. It states that it encourages the use of native landscaping. However, it doesn't require or provide examples of what a native plant is. It also doesn't limit what plant species could be used in a landscaping project, which allows for invasive plants such as autograph tree to be planted. But through these initial findings, I sought to amend this rule to require a certain number or percentage of native plants to be planted in future development projects. But before making amendments, I needed to talk to the community and assess the current landscaping. So to assess the landscaping status of two publicly used sites, I did a complete plant inventory of the landscaping at the Hilo County Building and at Local Park in Waikoloa Village. This would allow me to compare the landscaping of two public sites on East and West Hawaii and of differing ages to assess how to best amend the rule. Although these results are not representative of the island's landscaping as a whole, it provides an idea as to the status of the current landscaping. For each plant, I recorded the species common and scientific name or Hawaiian name if it had one, GPS coordinates, and Polynesian introduced or invasive. I also measured the deviation of trees that had a stem greater than 2 centimeters to get a sense of the shade that these trees provide. I counted a total of 152 plants at the county building, which is shown on the right, and 170 plants at Ha'oko Park. Shade that trees are providing based on whether they are native, non-native, invasive, or Polynesian introduced. I measured the DBH of all trees with stems greater than 2 centimeters and conducted a non-parametric crystal Wallace test and found no significant difference between the log of DBH and native status. Although there was no significant difference, the greatest DBH came from a non-native tree graph that native trees had a low range of DBH at these sites compared to non-native and invasive. This could suggest that native plants may not grow as fast as non-native trees or don't provide a lot of shade. The graph on the left depicts the number of individual plants at the county building and Ha'oko Park by their native status. I determined the native status by using the Plant Pono website and designated plants as invasive if their HPWRA score indicated that they had a high risk of invasiveness. Using a chi-square test, I found no significant association between native status and site. Ha'oko Park had high amounts of invasive plants and native plants, while the county building had the most number of plants that were non-native. Species richness of the native status of the county building and Ha'oko Park. The crystal Wallace tends to see if there is a difference in species richness between the sites and found no significant difference. Although there is no significant difference, there seems to be a trend toward more invasive species at Ha'oko than the county building and more native species at Ha'oko than the The overall takeaway from this plant inventory is that Ha'oko, which was a younger site, had more native plants than the county building. However, it also had the highest number of invasive species, which included the Mexican ground palm, which is a high fire risk tree for Lake Loa. And these trees were planted on the outskirts of the field. At the county building, native and Polynesian introduced plants were not used as much, and these results suggest that the landscaping around parking lots invasive plants include more than native. To amend the landscaping requirements was to use a community-based approach that would allow me to gain feedback from the community and from the people who would be most affected by a change in the conducted stakeholder interviews of landscape architects and engineers, landscapers, the planning department, administrative permits division, and the invasive species specialist. For these interviews, I gained approval from the IRB or the Institutional Review Board. Research. So to protect the identity of the people I interviewed, I will not be acknowledging names and refer to them by their interview group. Person for most of my interviews and in Zoom for others, with conversations varying from 30 minutes to an hour. I recorded each interview with Otter AI or my iPhone voice memo app. And then I later transcribed them and to analyze each response. I was listening to them over and over while also reading the transcription. I used a coding method and started to see some common categories between the interviews, like key concepts, such as educational resources and outreach, plant suggestions, rule changes, and improvements to the rule. I asked them questions about the current landscaping rule, whether they had thoughts about improving it, and if they would like to see native plants be required in the future. I had this quote from one of the landscapers I interviewed. He said, "Figure out what's pico, what's naturally occurring in that place." And I feel like this quote really emphasizes my goals for this project about using plants that are naturally occurring, such as native plants. It's from the landscape architects and engineers group in particular led me to change the direction of my initial amendments. I was made aware that making a rule too strict or requiring even a percentage of native plants would not go well for developers. Most of the time, they copy and paste landscape plans, and so changing the requirements would receive negative feedback from some folks in the community. However, many of my interviewees expressed the need for more resources and education materials about native plants, where they grow, how they grow, and they want something easy to understand for someone with little to no background in native plants. Last but not least, the third component of my approach was to gain further feedback from the community by sending out a quick online survey. This method also required approval from the institutional review board. And so the survey was anonymous and would take about 5 to 10 minutes to complete. The agency's listservs, and the survey had 8 multiple choice questions and 2 short answer questions, which asked people what native plants they like to see planted in commercial areas and public parks, and what factors influence them to purchase. The multiple choice questions asked people to tell me what district of Hawaii Island they live in, and if they knew the county had these landscaping rules, and a series of ranking questions about the current landscaping around the island. I received a large number of responses and feedback from people all around the island who were interested in seeing change to the landscaping, and got a total of 92 responses over the 2 months I left the survey open. And I also got responses from each district around the island. At table 2, based on the average scores for the ranking questions, the community says that landscaping needs improvement, and found that there was a correlation in responses for those who answered about requiring native plants in commercial areas, and would also respond the same to requiring plants in parks. They asked to rate the availability to purchase native plants, and it was sometimes available on average. I also asked them to select whether they purchased the plants to see whether there was a trend, and it seems like 42% of responses purchased plants from plant nurseries, which is great because they are more likely to carry native plants. I asked 2 short answer questions to learn what kinds of native plants people like to see in the landscaping, and many of the common native plants that were suggested included ohia, ohina, and then they also suggested tea, hollow, edible plants, flowering plants, and some responses said they did not know enough to answer or what a native plant was. Is from the plant inventory was that invasive and non-native plants are being used more than native plants. In my interviews, they expressed that they would like more access to resources and what resources are available, and to not make the rule too restricting. And from my survey, I learned that there is limited knowledge on what native plants are in the community, and that they would like to see an improvement in the landscaping. So reflecting on these analyses, I recommended a more passive approach to amending the rule instead of adding strict rules that would cause more harm than good in those affected by this rule. The best way to do this is to create education materials in addition to making rule amendments, instead of making it a requirement to plant natives. I wanted to provide examples attached to the rule for reference, and instead of requiring natives, I would make a list of plants that should not be planted due to their high risk of invasiveness. So through this new approach, I created a landscaping guide for Hawaiʻi County, which was a brochure that had definitions of a native, non-native versus invasive, questions on what plants to use, online resources that are easy to use, and a list of invasive plants to not plant in their yards or landscaping. Department when given to those submitting a development plan. Oscar at their Lāʻau month event, which was a series of native plant giveaways held around the island. I was able to hand down my brochure, answer any questions the community had about landscaping native plants. And I really enjoyed being at these events and seeing people come to pick up their native plants that would eventually be spread throughout the community and planted in their yards. And people who were very familiar with native plants and those who were very new but were willing to learn more, and just overall enjoyed talking to folks in the community. So the largest part of my project was working on making recommendations to amending the Rule 17 landscaping requirements. I will be going over my suggested rule amendments in the order they appear in the document. So one important aspect of these amendments that I've adapted from what I learned through the community and through research is that it is important to use plants that have a low risk of invasiveness. Adding this to a purpose statement that states that other species adaptable to the environment, I wanted to be clear that they are low risk of invasiveness. Next, I would like to add definitions to the rule that will act as a reference in making the definition between invasive, non-native, native, and Polynesian introduced more clear. This was one concern that I observed through my interviews and surveys, that it can be confusing what exactly defines a native versus a Polynesian introduced plant, and the difference between the plant can be non-native and it doesn't necessarily mean it's invasive. I also added a definition of a low risk plant. Section 17-6 landscape standards, I suggest adding this sentence that says trees concern expressed by some people in the community was the lack of shading in the parking lots, and that there was a lack of enforcement because some businesses will trees and trim them after they get approved so that they don't provide any more shading. And then there's also been some instances where people have taken out their landscaping after it has been approved. So just increasing that enforcement and increasing shade in these hot parking lot environments. A significant part of my recommended changes to the rule focus on 17-7 plant material and installation standards. I'd like to add that plant material shall prioritize native, Polynesian introduced, drought-tolerant plants, and if non-native, shall be low risk. Based on the Hawaii Pacific Reed Risk Assessment that characterizes plants' risk of invasiveness with a series of questions, plants that are low risk have a score of 1 or lower. And additionally, I reference examples of native and Polynesian plants within an examples attachment. This is a snippet of the examples attachment that I've created. And I've used plants that were recommended through by my interviewees, and also plants that I saw that were native or Polynesian introduced in my plant inventory. I organized these plants by climate zone so that it will be easier for people to find what plant grows in their specific area, with examples of places around the island for that climate type. So the climate zone types are coastal dry and mesic, inland areas dry, inland mesic, and inland wet. I also include the growth form of each plant, some example photos, and whether the plant is a shade tree. This list is not exhaustive because there are many other native and pollination introduced plants, and many of these plants can be found in other climate types, but I wanted to create something simple and easy to understand, sort of like a baseline for people referring to this rule. At the bottom of this examples attachment, I have a list of plants that are drought tolerant, of native and non-native plants, to give some flexibility in plants that are able to grow in wide ranges of habitats, from 0 to 3,000 foot elevation. The resources I used to create this included the Go Native database portal and Plant Portal. And some of these plants include like Pokinakina, Hawaiʻi, and Plumeria. Second component of this section is the prohibited plant material, or my do not plant list. Plants shall not have an HPWRA score of 7 or greater, which means that they have a high risk of becoming invasive and shall not include any of the following. So this is a list of high-risk invasive plants that are used in landscaping organized by the HPWRA score. I created this list using the Big Island Invasive Species Committee's Do Not Plant list, with also guidance from Molly and Darcy at BIS to create this list. You can see lantana at the top of the list with others like Alpesia and autograph tree. Lastly, in this section of plant material and installation standards, I'd like to add this section that focuses on fire risk areas. Areas that are prone to drought or with high fire risk should use the Hawaiʻi weed fire risk assessment to assess the fire risk of weed plants. And I thought this was super critical after doing my plant inventory, Waikoloa, where I saw the Mexican fan palm being used in their landscaping. The resource for this is also referenced in the later section, and it can be accessed to see if their plant is causing the fire risk. Under the maintenance standards, I'd like to edit the irrigation requirement so that areas with high amounts of rainfall and or with plants that are drought tolerant have the choice to not install an irrigation system. This was a concern for some people I interviewed, that an irrigation system is not always needed because it can be costly, but in wet areas like Hilo, landscaping does not typically require irrigation, which will save the developers money and save on water. Last but not least, I recommend adding in a new section to provide native plant resources and useful links. It emphasizes the benefits of planting native plants, which includes reduced needs for water, fertilizer, and insecticide. Also provide resources that are helpful in addition to the list, the examples attachment, which include Plant Pono, Go Native, Native Plants Hawaiʻi, and the Hawaiʻi Weed Fire Risk Assessment. That concludes all of my suggested amendments to the rule. The rule is currently in the process of waiting to be reviewed by the Planning Department Director and staff. And after many meetings with my mentors at the Planning Department and other county stakeholders, we were able to finalize a rule that I sent forward to them, and just waiting to go to a public hearing and officially be approved and adopted. This project has taught me about the importance of community outreach, education, and compromise. I was able to raise awareness about the importance of planting native plants over invasive plants, as well as promote the amending of the landscaping rule. Through this outreach and receiving feedback from varying perspectives, I learned that compromise is an important aspect of rule changing that will affect people in the community. As in incorporating each of their needs, I was able to come up with the best solution. I originally wanted to require the use of native and Polynesian introduced plants by a number or percentage, but realized that wouldn't be feasible as not every native or Polynesian introduced plant can grow fast enough or produce enough shade as many non-native plants do. The most significant takeaway from this that I wanted to change was the limiting of invasive plants. Although there is a lack of regulation on what plants can be sold by chain stores and nurseries, I wanted to limit them for being grown in communities. Continuous outreach and education on this topic is significant so that it sticks. And hopefully this outreach and education on the benefits of native plants will lead to a lower demand in invasive plants and higher demand in native, so that nurseries and stores will shift away from selling invasive plants. The skills that I've gained through this project allow me to grow my voice in the community and make changes that will benefit others and the environment. And I'd like to say mahalo to my mentors Bethany and Kendra, my advisor Lisa, and to Molly and Oscar, my interviewees and survey participants, TCBES, and my community. Mahalo. The question was if there is a specific native plant that I would think would be planted in Hilo, but I don't see often. A lot of native plants out there. But one of the great ones that is planted I've seen is Pomina Hilo. I love Pomina Hilo. They just make a really good like ground cover. And I've seen it planted in Hilo, but I've seen not enough. Yeah. Mm. Yeah, so the question is why non-natives are planted more in Hilo. A lot of the non-native plants were the shower trees line the outskirts of that parking lot. And it was an older development area. I'm not exactly sure when it was put in. I think it was maybe, I'm not sure, but I think, yeah, back then they just used a lot of non-native plants. I think there was less access to the native plants, I would assume.
Question is, for those changes, how do those compare to, I don't know, the less experience?
So I did look into Maui County. They have a Maui County planting plan. So 25% shade of trees was one thing I adopted from their planting plan. And I think they do a really good job in listing out a bunch of different plants that can be used in the landscaping. So I kind of like got ideas from there. So I didn't look into like New Zealand or other areas. Valley County, I think they're doing it. I'm not sure how enforced it is. Sure, I don't remember seeing a do not violence. Yeah.
If this. What would you?
So the enforcement mechanism, I've talked about this with my mentors because we're trying to like maybe waive their permit fee. But there isn't really a fee for applying for development. And there's not a lot of staffing, so that would be like, they would need more funds to provide staffing to enforce. And then hopefully. Sure on that part, yeah. So the question is how individuals kind of. Yeah, I think talking with people that are actually affected by any change in policy is like the number one first step before making that policy change, just because they're the ones being affected. And I got great input and insight onto what I had in my idea of my change and how certain groups of people, and then that led me to change my direction in the policy. So yeah, I think talking with individuals is very important and it's people in the community. I really enjoyed doing that, talking with people. It was really fun when I talked to the landscapers at the resorts because they took me on a tour of the whole like, landscaping. So that was pretty fun. Yeah, a lot of them were very interested and they expressed a lot of gratitude. That was really rewarding.